You ought to be in pictures. You're wonderful to see. You ought to be in pictures.
Hi, and welcome to Deep Dive Movie Reviews with my friend Steve Hackman and myself, James Marsh. And this is episode 4 of Every Best Picture, where we will be talking about the 1931 Oscar Best Picture winner, Cimarron.
But before we begin our review of Cimarron, if you haven't already subscribed to Deep Dive Movie Reviews, go ahead and hit that button. It would be a great favor to us. And just as a reminder, Deep Dive Movie Reviews does contain spoilers, so you have been warned. James, tell us about Cimarron.
Okay, so Cimarron, 1931, Best Picture winner, directed by Wesley Ruggle, adapted from the novel by Edna Ferber. It's the first Western ever to win Best Picture. And I was kind of amazed to discover that it wasn't until Dances with Wolves in 1990 that another Western won the top award. It just seems like one of those genres that is always going to sort of fare well with the Academy. But no, it was like a gap of 50 odd years or something like that.
And you know what's interesting, James, let me just jump in for a second.
Sure.
Is the Western genre was much more popular back in the day. So I just find it ironic that a Western wouldn't win again until Dances with Wolves, and then Unforgiven 2 years later. So in 90 and 92, the Western kind of made a comeback, but in a small degree. But Westerns in recent years have always been a little, not sure whether it's going to be well received or not. Whereas back in the day, Cimarron's day and the subsequent decades after that, you would have thought that Westerns would have formed more of the Best Picture winners, but it didn't happen that way.
Yeah, I guess sort of from today's perspective, they're seen as more of a kind of prestige picture. I mean, you look at The Power of the Dog this year was one of the big Oscar contenders. Maybe back in the 30s, 40s, the Western was considered far more of a kind of pulpy genre. Perhaps the way we look at sort of superhero movies, comic book movies today, the dime store novels were very often Westerns or detective stories or whatever. And so even from the earliest days of the Academy Awards, they were shying away from this kind of genre movie and looking for more sort of prestige dramas.
Interesting, yeah, because that grand scale cinematography lends itself these days. If you're going to do a Western, you're going to do like a Power of the Dog with a powerful soundtrack and sweeping vistas, and a lot is going to be centered in on the production values of recreating this lost age of the Western, like you said, as opposed to, like you said, the maybe more pulpy aspect of the 30s, 40s, and 50s.
And it's funny because, it didn't really start out that way, but over time, the Western has also become sort of arguably the quintessential American genre, but also a way of sort of looking back on American history and using it allegorically to examine other facets of society and civilization over time. So I think as a storytelling genre, it has become a more powerful tool over time, perhaps.
Yes.
Much like sort of the horror movie, on the one hand, you have it's a pulpy slash or whatever, but on the other hand, it's it's a Vietnam War allegory or what have you, and so I think perhaps as a subject or as a tool of storytelling, the Western genre has just sort of how to articulate what I'm trying to say, has just become more powerful, or has more arrows to its bow, if you like, or more strings to its bow over time. Well, it's gained in power.
I think the modern Western actually also, we hold it up as a microscope to our social values of an age gone by and how they've evolved. But as I'm going to mention in just a few minutes about Cimarron, I was pleasantly surprised, despite a lot of racial and gender stereotypes in Cimarron, that there was this constant underlying theme and message of dignifying, like the American Indian, of dignifying certain values that we would see as being progressive today. And I was pleasantly surprised to see them highlighted, albeit in maybe a lesser or undeveloped form, in a movie that's nearly 100 years old.
For sure. Yeah, no, I think, and the other one is feminism, I think, is such a big part of the story as well. I mean, lest we forget, it was adapted from a novel, a sort of a recent novel at the time. It was the biggest bestseller of the previous year, written by a woman, Edna Ferber, and she wrote it actually as a satire on sort of feminist values within sort of the Old West, but then it became representative of it, and it was interpreted by contemporary audiences as this real sort of championing story of sort of the frontier woman, you know, who has to pull herself together and run the household, run the business, raise the children while her man is off gallivanting, you know, trying to do whatever.
Yeah, it must be said that our star character, played by Richard Dix in this film, has a serious case of FOMO.
yeah, he really does not want to stay at home at all. He always wants to be somewhere else.
He has a fear of missing out, man. I've got to, even though everything's going well for me here, I've established a business, I got the respect of my community. There's still stuff out there. There's a wanderlust that boy has that I can identify with, but I'm surprised that marriage lasted.
Well, this is it. And, you know, and you could argue, did it only last because he wasn't there most of the time? And that she had to do it all on her own. And would she have achieved the heights, you know, because she ends up becoming a senator at the end of the movie. Would she have achieved so much had he stuck around?
I just have to correct. She became a congresswoman, not a senator. That's I have to bring in the American. To be honest, you know,
I don't know the difference.
Yes.
So she became a politician. Is that fair?
She became a politician. Yes.
Yes. She was. Yes, she was elected to public office.
And again, I mean, not many women were elected to public office. Not many women were running their own newspapers. So again, despite, and I know that there's criticisms about this film for its racial and gender stereotypes, I'll say it again, is the very fact that Sabra Cravet, the wife in this, basically runs the newspaper and then gets elected, as you say, to public office. For that to be highlighted in a movie from 100 years ago, I think is kudos to the movie.
Well, this is it. I think one of the most fascinating and interesting parts of watching this movie, which I was watching for the first time here in 2022, you know, over 90 years after it was made, pretty much, is the fact that it's this great sweeping old-timey Western epic that spans 40 years, but brings audiences right up to the present day.
Yes.
You know, Cimarron ends in 1929, 1930. You know, the year it was made, essentially. And so for contemporary audiences, it's staggering for us to look back and realize how recent the Old West was, you know, and the Wild West was, you know, and how far America came and as a nation in one man's lifetime, which I guess is the entire point of the story, really.
Just how the development exploded, and cities. I love where you would see cities and towns represented in, say, 1880. And then, like you said, 40, 50 years later in 1929, just the development. And, you know, you and I live in Hong Kong, China, and we've seen, I mean, I've been part of going into China mainland for 30 years. Same thing. I remember towns it was all bicycles and shacks, and now there's spiraling skyscrapers and highways and cars everywhere. It's a similar development story of America and China, this movie, and what we've witnessed in our years here in Asia.
That's right. And I think it's a great sort of film that to encapsulate that the speed and degree of that development in such a relatively small amount of time. I mean, I realize we haven't actually laid out what the bare bones of the plot are, so let's do that right now. The film starts at the Oklahoma land rush in 1889, and we follow Yancey Cravet, who already has something of a shady past that we only kind of piece together bit by bit as the story goes on, who sort of ups sticks. He lives in Wichita, Kansas, and he ups sticks with his new bride, Sabra, played by Irene Dunn, and they head to Oklahoma for this land rush, where Sioux Indian and Cherokee Indian territory is being sort of opened up for anybody, for the first person who can get there. Essentially,
let's just give away other people's land as if it's our own.
Yeah, so I mean, immediately there are problems there, but hey, it happened. So you know, America, you have to deal with your history, as we do with ours, and everybody does with theirs. So they are, you know, and he has his sights set. He goes, I know exactly which piece of land I want. I'm going to set up a ranch, and then he's beaten to that plot of land by a young woman called Dixie Lee, played by Estelle Taylor, who kind of pulls a fast one on him.
Yes.
You know, she's a pretty sneaky lady who will come to feature, you know, continually in the story. So he has to scrap that idea, and the family instead go to the exactly the kind of town that we were just talking about, Osage, which at this moment in 1889 is little more than a stretch of muddy road and a few wooden houses, but would very quickly become, you know, a booming sort of county seat, if you like. And he falls back on his sort of plan B, which is to open a newspaper. He had the Wichita Wigwam back in Kansas, and so he opens the is it the Oklahoma Wigwam? Yeah, the Oklahoma Wigwam in Osage, and that gives them a business, and it helps bring some respectability to the town. Is kind of the plan. You know, he sees like someone needs to be reporting on everything that's happened, hold people accountable for you know, crimes and misdemeanors in the area, and not least the fact that there had previously been a newspaper until that the old publisher was gunned down, and so that's kind of the first story that he goes after, is who shot the guy who previously had his job, and it goes from there.
What I found interesting, the whole theme of the Yancey Cravet plays a lawyer. It's also shown that he's a lawyer, and he's going to go in and also bring law to Osage, and it kind of reminded me of The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance with Jimmy Stewart and John Wayne, where you have basically this the law of the gun versus the rule of law colliding in the Old West, and what was going to who was going to be ultimately the winner. In this film, it's interesting that Yancey Cravet actually does both. He's both a gunman and a lawman, and so he's kind of walking both sides of that argument. But it's quickly brought in that he, like you said, he's got a relationship with the local bandit, the Kid. And so that obviously is one of the first plot points that is addressed in the film. But I think it's probably at this point to start critiquing the elements that I thought didn't work in it. And obviously there's a gunfight between him and the Kid after they'd already established that they have a relationship, they have a past working together, and it's kind of alluded that maybe it was less than legal. But Yancey Cravet's trying to make this, he's going to do good. He's going to be the newspaper man, bringing righteousness and goodness to the Wild West. And he ends up in a gunfight with a number of the local baddies, killing the Kid. And the thing that kind of irritated me was, obviously it's discovered that he's going to get all of this reward money for basically cleansing out the last of the bandits in this area of the West. Like, civilization's coming in, the government's going to give you 30,000 US because of this great deed that you've done. And he tells his wife, I don't want the money, because the Kid and I, you know, we used to sleep out in the prairie together. We used to look out at the stars together. And he says, I had to shoot him because he might have shot you or our kids. That's the way I did it. I didn't do it for the money. And it's like the writers wanted us to have this deep knowledge of this relationship, and yet they didn't give us the backstory really to feel the emotion of what that moment could have been. And it's kind of my critique through the whole film, is it's so sweeping over the course of just 2 hours that you just get these little disjointed vignettes that we just have a moment to invest ourselves into before we jump ahead 10, 15, 20 years. And the whole story's changed, and it's really limited connection to what went on before it.
Yeah, no, I think that's an absolutely fair comment. And I think it does get frustrating because you have these two very compelling characters in Yancey and in his wife Sabra, and every time we see them again, Yancey is wearing a different hat, whether he's being the newsman or the lawyer or the preacher at one point. or whatever, but you never get the full story of how he came to wear all these hats and why he chooses to be this way. You know, he has this ridiculously floppy hair that I just wanted to mention, particularly when he's defending Dixie in court. And then every time you go back, you have Sabra, who has come on leaps and bounds every time in this small town, you know, where she is now running the newspaper, where she is raising the children, where she is dealing not that well with the fact that her son, Cimarron, also called Cimarron after the territory, is now dating an Indian girl, and
Yes.
and she doesn't like that. She changes her opinion over time.
Mm-hmm.
But that's another of those developments that you don't really see happen.
Right.
You just see, oh, she was racist, and then when she becomes a congresswoman at the end, she's like, and I'm no longer racist thanks to my son. You're like, okay, but there seems like a journey that you could have made an entire movie out of.
Yes,
almost.
Yeah. We don't get to connect the dots. We don't get to connect the dots. We're just kind of given this and given that, and then you just have to take it for granted that something occurred.
Yeah, I mean, one film that it reminded me of, you're talking about The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, another Western, it reminded me of Giant, with Rock Hudson and James Dean and Liz Taylor, isn't it? Yeah, I think so. And where that similarly has this huge arc of fair, kind of similar in some regards, and you just check in with them now and again, and the whole world has kind of changed around them every time, ending up in kind of the present day then, or the very recent past, where they're really struggling to find their place or to use their money well or whatever in the present day. And I felt that this similarly, it felt like sort of the cliff notes to a much more engrossing and detailed saga that you never really quite got to see.
Exactly. There's so much more in this film that could have been fleshed out, because I mean, for example, at one point we see Yancey return after a 5-year hiatus. Nobody knows where he is, and it's just in time to defend Dixie Lee, the very woman, aka prostitute. I don't think the word's ever mentioned in the film, but it's kind of alluded. She's a woman with a colorful past.
She's a madam running a brothel,
right,
essentially.
Right. Like Ms. What's her name in Gone with the Wind, that Clark Gable has the relationship with. But yeah, he just suddenly materializes again, finds out that she's being prosecuted for being a public nuisance, finds out there's no defender. He's going to be her defender, much to the chagrin of his wife, who feels it a personal affront to her that he's defending this woman with a colorful past or a colorful life, and the very one who cheated him out of the stake from the beginning of the film. And there's no, I mean, he does a very nice explanation of why everyone gets a defense. And again, this is one of the elements I did enjoy in this film, is some of the values 100 years ago that we take for granted today being voiced in a medium that I wouldn't have naturally lent, that these kind of ideas would have lent themselves to. But I just found that the gravity of having this whole section of the film merely in this defense of her being a public nuisance, just a very underwhelming element within the film. It took away from this grandeur, and we're conquering the West, and suddenly we're going to pause for 20 minutes and have this court situation where the stakes are so low. There is just no element here that I found was worthy of the grandeur of what this film was supposed to be.
Well, I interpreted that moment as not him sort of coming to the defense of a wronged woman, and telling the community to wise up about their old-fashioned values, but rather him just reasserting himself on the community and his position on the community. I mean, for me, that scene was far more about him strutting around the courtroom like a rooster, as I said, with this floppy fringe that just won't go away, than it is about him genuinely fighting for the rights of this woman.
Yeah, no, I can see that.
Oh yeah, no, I just wanted to check. I just quickly looked up Edna Ferber's original book, Cimarron, because what we were talking about is like this did feel like sort of highlights of a much larger story. But her original novel is only 300 pages long. I was wondering, is it like this huge tome, 1,000-page tome or something?
James Michener or something.
Yeah, right. But no, it's not. So so again, it feels like it's just checking in. But then it's funny that what you were saying, that the film does exude kind of these sort of virtues, and in a way sort of educate its audience, educate the community, and by extension the audience about look how far we've come, look how well we're doing, while at the same time continuing to display some other kind of fairly awful habits and stereotypes and prejudices along the way, not least let's start with little Isaiah.
Yes, I was going to go there.
Yeah, well, I think we have to. There's no ignoring it. I mean, we are introduced to Yancey and his family in Wichita in sort of the late 1880s, just before they set off. And Isaiah, who is the houseboy, should we call him? For want of a better word, is suspended above the dining table in a little kind of cradle where he is lying on his front, 6 feet above the dining table, and fanning the family as they eat lunch, and is told to keep doing so at one point when he becomes so engrossed in Yancey's storytelling, and then ultimately is distracted again and falls out of it and crashes down onto the table, and who knows what would happen to him after that. But then he kind of tags along and has a bit of a rocky time of it.
Yeah.
It's such a jarring caricature of we know what it's of.
Well, even after, it's obviously a few years after the emancipation of the slaves in America, but obviously that position is still very much part of the American structure system. Yeah.
Now, just to check in and clarify, because I'm not American, my American history. So would this be considered the Jim Crow era?
I think Jim Crow, to be honest, I think Jim Crow actually came later I could be wrong. I have to look it up. I'm pretty sure that was the early 20th century when,
okay.
I don't think we're quite in Jim Crow yet. This is just a few years after the Civil War. Obviously, we're looking at
we're about
20 years out. We're about 20
right.
years out. That scene was bothering to me, the fanning of them, but also he gets shot and killed. And as he's dying, he's saying, Master Yancey, and just having somebody saying master, it's kind of sends little chills up my spine. But Yancey, and going back to kind of your observation earlier about how Yancey, although he is a noble guy, some of that nobility is to feed his own ego.
It's very self-serving.
It's a very self-serving. So after he's defended the town and his family, poor little Isaiah is dying, and he doesn't think to check, is Isaiah okay? He walks actually right past him as he's dying and never notices him. And this kind of feeds into your observation that Yancey, while a good guy, has got a lot of selfishness that drives his ego.
It's the moment when the kid, after being warned not to touch Osage and you'd be okay as far as Yancey's concerned, can't help himself, but they come in and they rob the bank, and it ends in the shootout where he shoots the kid. But poor Isaiah is collateral damage in that shootout, and dies, begging for his master, who just walks on past because he's wants to check on his own family. And I think arguably, the film does ultimately give Yancey sort of absolution, and he does find I'm not sure what the right word I'm looking for is, but it ends with a great selfless act.
Yes,
a sacrifice and a great selfless act. But I think it takes him the entire movie to get there.
Yeah.
I think like you said, yes, he's a very educated man and a noble and a virtuous man, and he will be the first person to tell you that. And so he is, but only when compared to those around him. I think he will do whatever it takes to ensure that he's the most virtuous man in the room, if you know what I mean. So yes. I think everything he does is fairly self-serving, to the extent that he abandons his family for years and years, and then the first thing he does when he comes back is defend a woman who has been giving the entire community grief and is their shame, and particularly his wife is leading the charge against her almost. And he completely disregards any of the context for it.
No.
Just swan in and say his piece.
And that's what it comes down to. The guy's been gone for 5 years, doesn't know the context, but hey, I'm going to shine my light now. And I just also have to make mention of Richard Dix, the actor. That baritone barreling voice mixed with the floppy hair, as you mentioned, mixed with this over the top acting.
Well, his performance, I think, is still a bit of a hangover from the silent era, perhaps, because we're only a couple of years into the talkies.
Right.
And so silent film acting is by its nature more theatrical, because you don't have the luxury of language and nuance in that regard. So it has to be big physical gestures all the time. And I think that the transition has been, is still finding its feet.
No, that's a good observation. I was trying to think what I was trying to say about Richard Dix. Another observation I wanted to make was in Broadway Melodies, you had said that the uncle in Broadway Melodies who had the stutter was a tool used to convey you can trust this guy. And I thought it was interesting that the long-serving, loyal, not projectionist, copyright printer. Thank you. The printer has a stutter. And he's with them the whole time. He's loyal. He's loyal to Sabra. He's loyal to Yancey. And I just had that observation that seems to be something that was used back then. If I want to convey that this person is loyal and can be trusted, I give them a stutter.
Well, this is it. I mean, at no time is it even raised that with Yancey away for so long and Sabra working side by side with this guy year in, year out, that there would be any threat to their marriage, that there could be any chance of infidelity or romance between the two of them, which in all likelihood there could have been.
Sure.
But in 1930s movie land, no, even as a pre-code
film, yeah.
They're like no. So give the guy a stutter, and you're like, oh well, yeah, she's not going to go for him. He's got a stutter. He's no threat whatsoever. Okay, so as we know, Cimarron won Best Picture, and as we discussed at the top of the show, it was the first Western to win, and another Western wouldn't win until 1990. There were also another couple of firsts, as we're going to get in these early years. Cimarron was the first film to be nominated for what are considered the Big Five awards: picture, director, actor, actress, and screenplay. Which a number of films have been nominated for over the years, but only 3, I want to say, have actually won all 5 of those. Cimarron also is one of, I think, only 2 films to have been nominated in every category for which it was eligible, which is quite a feat. Didn't win. Okay, so in addition to Best Picture, or Outstanding Production, as it was still called at that time, it won for Best Writing, or adaptation, and also for Best Art Direction. And it did pretty well, and was considered pretty successful at the time. I mean, it was very expensive. It was RKO, and I think it was one of only 2 RKO pictures that would ever win Best Picture. But I think at the time, because obviously this was made right at the height of the Great Depression, but they still pumped, I think, about $1.5 million into it, which at that time and in those conditions was insane. And I think on first release, it didn't make its money back. It only made about $500,000 back. So they kept releasing it. They re-released it in 1935, where it did far better. And so I think over time, it definitely recouped its cash. But it was well received, particularly for the big Oklahoma Gold Rush sequence at the beginning, which had like 5,000 extras, and it's historically interesting because RKO bought a whole bunch of land just outside LA in order to shoot that sequence, and that became one of these movie ranches that the big studios would invest in. If you've seen Once Upon a Time in Hollywood recently, there's this notion of the movie ranch, just a big plot of land outside of the city where you can go shoot all your exterior stuff, whether it's for Westerns or whatever. And so that was, I think, the first one of those. So that's where they shot all of this. The only other thing I wanted to point out was just how big a deal the novel was. We talked about it was like the biggest bestseller of 1930 of the previous year. And it was so beloved as a piece of sort of nostalgic Americana, if you like. It was reprinted in what was called, I think, an Armed Forces edition, which was a very small, compact paperback that soldiers could keep on them and keep in their pockets during World War II. So they could have it on them without it weighing them down too much or cluttering up their backpack or whatever, because it was just such a sort of a loving, nostalgic tribute to to remind them what they were fighting for. It was one of those novels that was like, here, give it to the troops on the front line. This is the America back home. This is what you're doing. And I think in that regard, I think that's valid. I think that the film captures that. I think what did impress me about the film more than anything else was how vividly it portrayed this evolution, the complete turnaround of the country in such a small period of time. Within 40 years, it's gone from the Wild West to civilization as we know it. Even though you're right on the cusp of a Great Depression, it doesn't touch on that, and it has at least taken steps towards righting so many of the wrongs that were still relevant up until recently.
So James, as a final score, obviously when we're doing our Oscar Best Pictures, we're not reviewing the film per se. What we're doing is analyzing, ultimately, after everything we've said, does Cimarron hold up? Does it stand the test of time? Does it earn its place in Oscar history? What's your verdict on that?
I'm going to say by and large, yes. I think, it doesn't have the sort of the fluidity of storytelling that sort of Wings or All Quiet on the Western Front does. It's certainly a much better film than something like Broadway Melody. And I think, in one regard, I think it bites off more than it can chew. As we've said, it feels a little bit like it's a little too episodic. It doesn't explore, it doesn't explain why its characters do the things they do, it rather than just simply document the things that they do and the changes that they undergo. However, I was into it. I was kind of engrossed in it, involved in it. I think the story itself, like I said, that period of American history was so fascinating, such a speedy development and evolution, that I think, particularly at such an early time in the history of cinema, I think it accomplishes enough to kind of excuse some of the missteps. So, I'm glad I saw it, and I wouldn't have seen it probably had it not won Best Picture. So in that regard, I have to say yes, I think.
I'm nearly going to echo everything you just said, except I'm going to give a verdict slightly on the other side of that line, that I'm going to say it doesn't hold up, and it doesn't. To say it doesn't deserve its place in history may be a little harsh. I'll refrain from saying that, but I don't think it stands the test of time. I thought initially that whole land rush scene was beautifully shot. I thought, I'm really going to get into this, a nice old Western, and it was hit or miss for me throughout the film. I found the acting a little subpar. The vignettes were, some were interesting, some weren't. Like you said, there was too much that was, you had to assume about what people's motivations were. I struggled with that, albeit this movie takes a big swing. It swings for the fences. It tries to be the grand scale, telling this tale over decades. So I applaud it at a certain level, but ultimately I'm going to come down on the side of this film. Westerns are done better in future years, and this one doesn't quite measure up.
All right.
There we go.
All right, then. Well, thank you very much for watching our deep dive on the 1931 Best Picture winner, Cimarron. Please feel free to leave a comment below. Let us know what you think of the film. Does it stand the test of time? And also, are there any other films outside of this series that you'd like to hear our thoughts on? Ideas for future series? Let us know. Take a look at our other videos. We've got like 35, 36 other videos now detailing new releases, as well as check out the other episodes of Every Best Picture from Wings up to today.
Yeah, and this series is going to go on for the next couple of years. Obviously, we're only on film number 4. We've got a whole lot more to go in this series. Join us on this film journey. So hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Also, James and I are on social media. So if you want to find us on Twitter or Instagram, those links are in the comment section below. James, until next episode.
Goodbye.
Bye.
You're wonderful to see. You ought to be in pictures. Oh, what a hit you would be.